Hello everyone. I hope you're all having a wonderful day, and I want to welcome you to this educational presentation on the stages of grief and loss, and how grief differs within different cultures. Now, before we get into the real informational portions of this presentation, I'd like to let you all know a little about myself. My name is Anthony Mackar. I use he, him pronouns, and as of this recording, I am a therapy extern at the Department of Health and Human Services at Hoffman Estates, under the supervision of Dr. Monica Saavedra-Kalusek and Dr. Audra Marks. I currently hold a master's degree in clinical psychology from Midwestern University, and I'm currently working towards a doctoral degree in clinical psychology as well. Now, why is it that of all the topics to choose to speak on, grief is the one I landed on? Well, there are a few reasons. First, at the time of the creation of this presentation, it was the start of a new year. With the new year comes transition, and oftentimes that transition is incredibly difficult if a person has just lost someone close to them. So naturally, it felt like a necessary topic to bring to the forefront. Secondly, COVID-19 was and is still very much a part of our lives. As much as we may want to forget the collective trauma we have been through regarding COVID-19, we've all still lost something or someone as a result of it. Grief and loss can come in many forms, not just the loss of an individual. And COVID-19 really brought that to the forefront of many people. And finally, although grief is collectively experienced throughout the world, it is not experienced in the same way. We'll go into further detail as we go on in the presentation, but an important factor to understand is that culture often impacts how people experience grief, and that is something to be explored. So let's get things started by discussing how the presentation will look going forward. First, we'll explore the different ways that different people and different cultures can experience grief. Following this, we'll explore the 7 distinct stages of grief, which include shock, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, reconstruction, and acceptance. After that, if you're up for it, I'll talk you through a guided imagery activity that is often found to be helpful for those experiencing grief. And finally, we'll close out with some closing thoughts. To start us off, grief is experienced incredibly differently throughout the world. For some cultures, grief is long-lasting, enduring, and never truly goes away, but instead evolves with the person experiencing that grief. In essence, grief lasts and has no true endpoint. However, for other cultures, there's a more distinct ending. Final death rituals, beliefs about the meaning of death, and other factors can play into a grieving process that is more short-term and often very different from the one experienced in the United States. Geographical differences can also be very impactful in the expressions of grief. For example, grieving individuals in North America, or more specifically the United States, that are suffering the death of a loved one or another significant setback benefit from the region's religious and cultural diversity. Religion and spirituality play an essential role in many Americans' lives. Christianity makes up the highest percentage of religious following. However, there are other religions that exist primarily due to immigration. In the United States, common grief and mourning rituals include community support following the death of a loved one. Funerals, cremations, wakes, and memorial services all make up the religious diversity of the various groups. However, many other religions exist primarily due to immigration. In the United States, common grief and mourning rituals include community support following the death of a loved one. Funerals, cremations, wakes, and memorial services all make up the religious diversity of the various groups. However, following the grieving events, most Americans find it uncomfortable and taboo to openly talk about grief, leaving the bereaved individuals to mourn their losses privately. This is in stark contrast to Eastern Asian cultural grieving practices, such as that of Japan. In Japan, celebrations of death include ancestral rituals in traditional villages, as well as a more modern take of grieving with regards to funerals and wakes. However, the Japanese spiritual philosophy and culture closely tie to that of Buddhist traditions of death and mourning, with some areas having influences from the Shinto religion. Where Buddhism's effect is more prevalent, the idea of an afterlife plays a significant role in the mourning process. The Japanese culture believes in birth, death, and rebirth cycles, and their grieving process allows for community support and prolonged mourning. The Japanese people express their grief openly, talking about their death and dying and their feelings. They also offer each other standard condolence messages, much like the Western world, where they express words of hope and comfort to the bereaved. Finally, another example of widely differing grieving rituals is that of Mexico. Mexican grief traditions involve openly grieving and honoring the dead and paying last respects to the deceased and the deceased's family. Death rituals almost always include elaborate funerals, preceded by a wake or a vigil that begins the day before the funeral and lasts all night. The family invites mourners to keep the deceased's family company throughout the night. praying together and ushering the dead into the afterlife. Mexican tradition has a distinct separation between the living and the dead, and they view death as permanent. However, traditional beliefs hold that the dead can often come back to visit the living, making the grieving process an enduring event. In essence, grief is a distinctly different experience depending on the culture it is being experienced in. However, through all that, grief is also a distinctly human experience, and one that holds similarities wherever it may be experienced as well. While the grieving cultural experience is often different, the inward grieving process within people is often experienced similarly. The 7 stages of grief, also known as the Kubler-Ross model of grief, describes the emotional and psychological journey people go through after experiencing a significant loss or change. While everyone's experience is unique, understanding these stages can help us navigate our emotions and eventually reach acceptance. So today, we're going to explore each of the 7 stages in depth. Now, it's important to remember that the 7 stages of grief, while often listed in a particular order, may not be experienced in that same order. One can experience and repeat each stage of grief as many times as necessary. Essentially, grief is not linear and will manifest in different ways for each individual person. The first stage is shock. Shock can often be considered the first line of defense in the body against pain. When we first hear about the loss, we may feel numb or disbelief. We may struggle to accept what has happened and try to convince ourselves that it isn't true. Like all stages of grief, shock is completely different for each individual and can last for a few moments or a few weeks, depending on the person. Coping with shock is often very difficult, but most often comes through awareness and identification. If a person can understand what is shocking them, to answer the question of what just happened, they can move on from the shock stage. The second stage is that of denial. The denial stage is yet another defense mechanism of the body, often used to avoid pain by denying its existence in the first place. Dr. Amy Duramus describes the denial stage as when loss still feels fake, when you know that the loss happened, but it doesn't feel like it. As a result, the denial stage is the body's way of buying time for the person to process their loss and adjust to the new reality. Coping through the denial stage is often based around reminding oneself of the real and true, the here and now. When a person begins to understand the facts, then denial loses its power. The third stage is anger. Once we begin to accept the reality of the loss, we may start to feel intense emotions such as anger or guilt. We may blame ourselves or others for what has happened, even if we have no control over the situation. This stage can be overwhelming and may last for several months. We may feel frustrated and helpless as we try to make sense of our loss. We may lash out at others or feel angry at the world for what has happened. In more simple terms, the anger stage of grief focuses on a person's perceived lack of control and a need to lash out in order to regain it. Oftentimes, the best way to cope with the anger stage of grief is through emotional regulation skills, like mindful meditation and breathing exercises, as it functions as a way to calm both the heart and the mind at the same time. The fourth stage is known as the bargaining stage. Similar to the anger stage, the bargaining stage is in response to a perceived lack of control and is the body's way of reaching out to try and regain that control. At this stage, we may start to bargain with ourselves or a higher power to try and reverse the loss. For example, we may think, if only I had done this differently, things would be okay. This stage is filled with what-ifs and if-onlys, and is also often followed by regret. Coping with the bargaining stage is often centered around reframing, and is essentially changing the what-ifs to I did what I cans. This regret, though, often leads to the fifth stage, also known as the depression stage. As we come to terms with the reality of our loss, we may start to withdraw from others and feel deeply sad or hopeless. We may reflect on the memories of what we have lost and long for what once was. This stage can be long and difficult, but it is an essential part of the grieving process. It's also important to remember that just because someone is in the depression stage of grief, it does not mean they're depressed. Feelings of sadness, withdrawal, fogginess, and other symptoms usually associated with depression are also considered appropriate responses to the great loss. Therefore, it's important to remember that this stage, much like the others, will also pass eventually. Coping with the depression stage can take many different forms, but often I find that reaching out to others and accepting one's own feelings are extremely effective coping methods. The sixth stage is the reconstruction stage, also known as the upward turn. This stage marks the beginning of the healing process. We may start to feel more optimistic and begin to adjust to life without what we have lost. We may find ways to cope with our emotions and start to feel more hopeful about the future. At this stage, we begin to rebuild our lives and make meaning out of our loss. We may start to focus on the positive things in our lives and find ways to move forward. This stage can be a time of personal growth and transformation. The final stage is acceptance and hope. At this stage, we have come to terms with the reality of our loss and have found a way to live without it. We may still feel sadness or nostalgia, as grief can be present long term, but we have found a way to move forward and create a new normal. We may feel hopeful about the future and have a renewed sense of purpose and meaning in our lives. Emily Dickinson writes in her poem titled "Hope is the thing with feathers" that hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. Notice how she does not say that the tune stops, but that we simply stop hearing it. Within grief, it often becomes hard to listen to the song of hope, and it is within the acceptance stage that we begin to hear the tune once more. At the end of the day, regardless of what culture or type of grief you're experiencing, death and loss are a natural part of life. There is truly no simple way through grief. It is a process that we must experience and grow through in our own way. We must also remember that the presence of grief means the presence of connection. It shows us what we care for and what held an impact in our lives. To end the presentation, I'd like to talk us through a guided imagery activity. Feel free to get comfortable wherever you are, and if at any point you need a break, feel free to take it. To begin, take a comfortable seat and rest. Slowly breathe deeply, in and out. Relax and settle, coming into the present moment. What is really happening to you, here and now? Now bring to mind a loss. This could be the recent death of a friend or a relative or a loved one. It could be a loss you've been carrying as a burden for a long time. It can even be something abstract, a loss of something within yourself. Anything will do. Start with your body and your immediate somatic experience. What bodily sensations do you notice? Do you feel grounded, spacey, tight, hollow, full, edgy, dull, squirmy? What do you notice? Don't interpret, just feel. What is your body saying to you right now? Now bring yourself to your heart, in the middle of your chest, and simply feel the heart holding the grief, being filled and heavied by that grief. Your raw, loving, vulnerable, beating heart, and rest with that. Now rest in your throat center. So often the throat is connected with grief, and it wells up in tightness and has a kind of ache that can arise when we're about to cry, when we're shocked, or when we have a sense of loss. Notice where else your grief is being held in your body. It can be your heart, your throat, your stomach. They all hold something. They are processing something. Without words, without direction, naturally the body knows. Then direct your attention to what emotions are arriving. Sorrow, anger, a quality of love, disappointment. There could be a sense of intensity or a sense of just being dull. Note what emotions are arising. Don't be embarrassed or afraid to feel whatever you're feeling. Don't judge what you're feeling. Just feel. Let your emotions manifest. Welcome them. Don't suppress them, and don't feed them. Emotions are the energy of our grieving, and they change. They're always changing, like life itself. Be gentle. If you start to feel overwhelmed, take a break. Rest. Breathe. Resettle. Allow yourself to rest in your present moment bodily emotional experience. Just rest. Just feel. Just be. Let grief do its work. Let it heal you. Don't push. Don't be impatient. Let yourself grieve. Process this change in your life and let it teach you. Now, come back to where you are. Open your eyes and feel how you are in the present moment. Thank you all again for taking part in this presentation, and I wish you all an amazing day.